Well, good morning, almost good afternoon, and welcome to the latest Out Leadership Lounge. I'm Todd Sears. I'm the founder and CEO of Out Leadership, and I'm excited to be joined today by John Thurlow, who's the COO of RBC Capital Markets. John and I are going to have a discussion around how to navigate your career in challenging times, and I'm really excited because John and I have known each other for a very long time. I'm catching up to him in terms of different career paths and different companies we've worked on or worked with each other together. Before we dive in, I want to take just a couple minutes to thank some folks and to give you a couple Out Leadership updates. First, I want to give a shout out to all of our members. We have 82 member companies, all of whom have supported Out Leadership, not just through this time, but through many years. Specifically, I want to thank our global sponsors, HSBC, Greenberg Traurig, RBC, of course, Ropes & Gray, KPMG, and EY. And I want to give a special shout out to HSBC, who not only has been a member and a supporter and a sponsor for many years, they've hosted and sponsored our summits around the world. And interestingly, we've been talking about the renewal of their sponsorship, and they're actually expanding their sponsorship with Out Leadership globally, not reducing it. And so I think that speaks really highly of the organization, and I want to thank them personally from the entire team at Out Leadership for not only their support, but for expanding their support in a challenging time. I also want to thank a few of the members who I know have joined and are on the line: Baker McKenzie, Clifford Chance, our friends at MasterCard, Hogan Lovells. I saw our buddy Sharon Lewis is on from Europe. Hi, Sharon. Mizuho, Goldman Sachs, Thomson Reuters, Brown Brother Harriman, and Macquarie. And I want to thank Macquarie as well. I know the team had a great call with them in Australia last night or 2 nights ago. And it's exciting to see all of our opportunities continue to expand with our member companies in this time, and I'm glad that they're staying as engaged as possible. We've got about 160 folks registered for today, which I think speaks to the interest in the topic, and hopefully we can deliver some great content for you. The final thing I want to just give you a quick update about is we're 5 weeks into this crisis from an Out Leadership perspective anyway. My entire team has been working remotely, as have pretty much everyone else. And I want to do 2 things. I want to update you on some of the initiatives, and I also want to thank my team. 5 weeks ago, we did pivot Out Leadership, as you've heard a couple of times on these video casts and others. And I'm really proud of a few things that we've been able to accomplish and that we've set into motion that I want to make sure that you are all aware of. The first, across our 4 pillars, which are leadership, talent development, advocacy, and research and content, we have pivoted and expanded our offerings. So on the leadership front, these vodcasts that you've been seeing, this is the 5th week of them. We have 2 to 3 of them per week. On everything from leadership in a crisis to COVID and HIV. My colleague Fabrice Houdart did last week a conversation with Sean Strub around HIV criminalization. Rufus Gifford yesterday had a conversation around journalism in the age of COVID, and including how this reporter has to navigate being in the White House press briefings, which is a job I can't even imagine. On the talent development front, I want to make sure everyone's aware that we have expanded our 10,000 Coffees online mentoring program, which we'll speak a little bit about mentoring today with John. We launched that last year with Out Next, our emerging talent platform, but we've actually been able to make that available to all of our member companies and all of our leaders globally. So that's something that I hope you'll take advantage of if you haven't already. We've also launched 3 new pieces of research around emerging talent. We've expanded our ally research, and we're also looking into our Quorum board program and our new piece of research there as well. All of that is going to be available coming up in the summer, including a virtual Pride platform that we're looking at, convening all of our companies around the entire month of Pride. So I hope you'll stay tuned and learn more about that and engage. And if you haven't gotten it, we'll make sure that you get it, because I know we have a lot of companies that are not yet members of Out Leadership on the line as well. I want to make sure that you get the virtual calendar that we've built. It's quite robust, as well as hopefully the in-person events that we'll continue to be able to deliver in the fall, thanks to the sponsors like RBC and the others on the line. So the final thing I do want to do is thank my team. They have worked tirelessly remotely, and for a team to pivot like they have, it's really been amazing, and I'm very grateful. Which leads me into our colleague here, John. Just a quick background on John, and you could read his bio in the invitation. John and I overlapped at Merrill Lynch. He actually started with a couple prior predecessor firms, and then we actually moved to Credit Suisse within about a year of each other from Merrill. And then I started Out Leadership 10 years ago, and he moved on to RBC, where he's had a number of roles, and his current role is the COO of Capital Markets. And what I've asked him to do is actually kind of start, because in his career, he's been able to see a number of crises, whether it's the financial crisis of 2008, the prior one. He was in Hong Kong for a number of issues as well. And so I've asked him to kind of think through those with us, share some of his learnings at different stages in his career and how those crises impacted both him and his career. And we'll go through several of those. As a final sort of logistical note, if you do have questions during the session, you can post them on the side here, and I will moderate them into the conversation at some point if we can make them all work. So with that, John, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Great, Todd. Thanks for having me. And I'm very proud to be here on behalf of RBC Capital Markets. And we're equally proud to be a lead sponsor of Out Leadership, along with the many other good companies that you referenced earlier. But it's my great pleasure to be here. And thanks to everyone who's calling in for joining us today.
Thank you, John. We really appreciate RBC and all your support. So let's start back early. Give me the first third of the career in terms of the trajectory, and then I want to dive into some of the learnings there in terms of some of the challenges and how you navigated them.
Good. So, well, I've got basically, I mean, if you can't tell, it doesn't take long for people to figure out I'm born and raised in New York City. And I actually went to Pace University for my undergraduate degree, and I went to NYU Stern for my master's. And while I was basically going to NYU, right after I finished NYU Stern, I moved to Merrill Lynch in '93 from Manufacturers Hanover, a bank that no longer exists. But I actually started out my career in finance at Manny as a bank teller in a day when basically you could go into a branch and speak to a bank teller. Really from there, I went to Merrill, and, at Manny, one of the good things about Manny, they had a lot of good credit training programs. I had a lot of good operations training programs. I worked in the Wall Street group, which was a terrific group, financed all the broker dealers. And I guess my first test on a crisis was when Drexel Burnham ran into problems, because we had a significant amount of loans. But it's too long ago to really focus on that. I would say, when I moved to Merrill in '93, and I had 16 wonderful years there, ending in May of 2009, I basically moved into that Treasury group, which was a good team to move into. But really what kind of got me exposed to basically, I'd say, crisis management and leadership, and basically kind of a whole new world of international basically living, was when Merrill asked me in late 96 to move to Hong Kong, which was about 6 months before Hong Kong was going to hand over to basically China from basically the UK.
Right.
It's an interesting time to go. Merrill had just bought a international broker-dealer named Smith Newcourt, and they basically asked me to go over and set up a treasury operations over there in 9 countries. And I'd start with 2 people. I almost had like a blank check to basically hire people throughout the countries. But I also had 2 kids at the time. I still have the 2 kids. But they were 3 and 5 at the time. And my wife at the time had never been outside the U.S., so it was a little bit of a challenge family-wise. But I knew 3 years into Merrill that it was kind of the place I wanted to develop my career. And frankly, at that point in time, I thought it was the thing I really needed in my career to launch it was a sustained international assignment. And I had spent a year living in London when I was in Manny, and I loved that as well. Really where I got my taste for living overseas was Hong Kong. And that basically 2 to 3 year assignment turned out to be 8.5 years, about 5 years in Hong Kong, 3.5 in Sydney, Australia. And then coming back to the U.S. to Merrill in 2004, which kind of gave me a good few years before we got into the global financial crisis, which was basically a very, very tough challenge. Particularly, I had moved back into Treasury at that time, and I was in charge of unsecured funding globally for Merrill.
Mm-hmm.
And I also had, was kind of, never home at that point in time. So it was a big adjustment. But and then I left Merrill in '09, not long after you did. And I've talked to you openly about it. It was a hard decision to leave, but it was a very different place after basically the Bank of America acquisition. And frankly, I really left because I needed some time off. I was completely burnt out by the crisis. I'd also gone through the loss of my mom at that time. I went through a divorce. And, I needed some time to actually get myself right. And I never really worried about Then went to Credit Suisse, where I had the good fortune to meet back up with you again. And then I joined RBC in May of 2015 after a relatively long courtship. But, honestly, it's been a place that come closest to me for feeling like how I felt at Merrill, and really part of a very proud, great brand, basically, and a big commitment to the U.S. in particular for a Canadian bank. And all of my kind of hopes and kind of what I was joining up with have been realized in a very positive way.
That's awesome. So I want to hone in on a couple of things that you talked about as a way to sort of dive into our conversation. One of the things that I loved about Merrill, and it sounds like we had this in common, was that the culture of Merrill Lynch. It was very unique at that time. I've never seen another company like it since. And one of the things that I think that was very, important of an important part of the culture, which I think you experienced, was the opportunity to have what Merrill would call rabbis, or sponsors and mentors, but especially sponsors, because a company like Merrill, as a sort of command and control, very sort of old school sort of management style, you had to have somebody above you sort of looking out for you and kind of pulling you along. And I think I'm curious, one, how did that work for you? How did you acquire the sponsors? If you can think of someone or a couple people to sort of share an anecdote about, and then as that led into different both career moves, but also how you navigated a crisis. Because I know for myself, going through some of those things, being able to have those people as an anchor to rely on was really important. So let's start there if you can. Tell me a little bit about the Merrill culture and some of the sponsors that you acquired while you were there.
So the Merrill culture, I do agree with you. I think it was unique. I mean, it was a very proud firm, a very strong firm, very committed basically to developing its staff. And one of the things that really struck me about Merrill in my relative youth at that point in joining was I still believe to this day Merrill was far ahead of other companies in the financial services sector on diversity and inclusion. I mean, some of my best mentors and sponsors early on were females or minorities, and basically, and I really just have a great memory of so many talented leaders that I spoke with, where I frankly never really thought twice about diversity from that standpoint. It was just incredibly smart people we were facing off to. And one of my early sponsors was the treasurer at the time was a woman named Teresa Lang. Terry Lang. He was the treasurer, one of the higher ranking female executives in Merrill at the time. And I'll never forget the first opportunity she gave me to do a roadshow with her across Europe from a treasury standpoint, and the time we spent together, because you spend a lot of time together, and actually kind of the engagement I had with her back and forth. It wasn't just me asking questions, it was her asking questions, right? So, and I think that really opened up my eyes to, again, just kind of working with talented people at Merrill and people who were truly invested in your career, providing you were given part of your career to them. I mean, you have to give a lot of time to organizations like that. And then I think so. Terry was probably my earliest mentor. There's another great two great ladies in operations, Diane Schuneman and Wendy Zucker.
Yeah.
Tremendous sponsors my time, and really just really solid, good people. And then, of course, you had people like Dan Tully and Dave Kamansky, who were really well known on Wall Street just for being highly principled leaders. And so, when you're relatively young and you get into a company like this, and they actually, the phrase, they basically just kind of give you room to run, but support you along the way and allow you to trip and fall and dust yourself up and get back on. And so, so really when they approached me in late 96 to move to Hong Kong, I mean, a funny story about that is I had already picked out, like in my mind, I had already picked out that I needed to do an international assignment to really help progress my career. But the only thing I knew I had to do was, kind of get that offer from the company and then frankly bring it home to my family. When you have sons 3 and 5 or kids 3 and 5, you don't need their vote, but you do need your spouse's vote, right? So but it was an opportunity where I had already picked out Hong Kong as a place where Merrill would have a need. So when they approached me, my mind was made up in 30 seconds. I just needed about 2 months to basically clear it at home. And even inside the company, I mean, there was a lot of people who actually said, you shouldn't do it. It's a big risk, but that's part of your career management is taking some risk. And again, the thing that really kind of opened my eyes to the risk you take is, number one, culturally, you very much find out very quickly you're not home anymore. When you land in a place like Hong Kong, it's very densely populated.
Yep.
It's a wonderful city, actually. And there's a great expat community. But you're a long way. I was there 2 weeks, and my grandmother, who I was very close to, passed away, right? So it was like, you can't go home. You can't get home for the weekend. So I missed everything about that. But, you learn to adjust, and it was a great experience. And really, the crisis that really struck me from a career standpoint, one is what's happening now. I really do think this is a significant crisis, very different from the global financial crisis. And then I lived in Hong Kong during SARS, so I know what it's like to be in the epicenter. And I also know what it's like to be isolated. Now, when you live in Hong Kong, your family lives in New York, you're truly isolated. My first exposure to a real crisis in Hong Kong is 5 months after landing there when the Asian currency crisis kicked in. Malaysia and Singapore shutting down its foreign exchange market,
Right.
penalizing offshore firms for basically what they called speculation in the foreign exchange market. And it was also my first time sitting on the trading floor and everyone looking at me from a treasury standpoint as to what are we going to do.
So
Right.
let's talk for a sec, John. With both of those, whether it was SARS or the currency crisis, like specifically, what did you do? What went through your mind? How did you, because you were earlier in your career at that point, and you've just moved to Hong Kong, and the desk that you're running and the business you're running just evaporated overnight, pretty much, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The next morning you walk into work. What do you do?
I think the next morning walking into work, I actually kind of took the pulse around the floor, the trading floor, and actually kind of seeing how people were reacting because it was a very big event and the Hong Kong government had stepped in to buy equities in the market. So the markets were free fall. You couldn't access funding. So people who had legitimate positions on their balance sheet could not access local funding for it. So I really gathered with people who've been in the region, who lived in the region for a long period of time, and basically made sure our communications back to New York for Merrill's headquarters was very strong and very tight. So honestly, Todd, what I did was I asked a lot of questions. I honestly had the first thing that morning, I still remember it, the head of equity derivatives asking me, what do we do now? I said, I honestly don't know, but we'll figure it out, right? And I really just kind of brought in the head of foreign exchange, the head of equity derivatives, our head of government relations in the region, took advice from New York, and basically started mobilizing as a team. And I think it's important in any crisis, you have to understand it's never about you or any one person. It really is always about the team, right? You have to have a team around you. You can be a vital part of that team, but you have to have a team around you who's invested in basically getting to a better place as you are. And again, having had many smart people around at Merrill and really throughout my career, Credit Suisse was also a lot of smart people. RBC, there's a lot of smart people, right? But at that point in time, it's really about just kind of trying to assess the situation and trying to stay calm. I mean, honestly, it's not easy to stay calm. And we also had the Hong Kong Monetary Authority in the same building. And the gentleman who ran it at the time, Joseph Yam, was a very well-known public figure in basically Hong Kong. So I would see him on the elevator and I'd always greet him and he would just kind of grunt at me. And sometimes I would pick up on how his day was just from his grunts, right? So I think, but again, just kind of going back to just bringing things back on the trading floor
Yeah.
and, not basically dismissing the seriousness of the situation, but trying to basically have a level of calm and seek input as well.
So, I'm chuckling about your elevator story. When I started at Maryland, I was a trainee. I was in the Fifth Avenue office, and Dave Kamansky still had his retirement office in that office. And I'd get to the office about 7 a.m. and I would end up riding the elevator up with him. And it was the same thing. I could tell what kind of mood he was in, and I was petrified of him. But at the same point, ultimately got to know him, and it was a huge opportunity for me.
Yeah, Dave was a big guy.
Literally.
Yeah.
So let's go to the SARS crisis, and I want to kind of hone in on a couple pieces that you've said thus far, because I want to kind of bring it to the current crisis towards the next section here. But you said asking a lot of questions, staying calm, building community, leveraging your team, and I want to talk about how we do all of those things now. But with SARS in particular, obviously that would be not even the closest because it's on a magnitude much smaller than what we're dealing with now. But I think the fear piece of it would be different from the crisis, right? In terms of any of the monetary crises we've seen are market kind of contained, but the actual fear of death and sickness and everything that comes with something like a SARS, how do you sort of add that element into navigating a crisis as a leader?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't. I'll just tell you. I mean, SARS happened right after I moved back to Hong Kong. We had been posted to Australia the end of '99, so I basically got sent back to Hong Kong in early 2003. And SARS happened pretty quick, and to be candid, my family wasn't thrilled about moving from Australia, period. And if you've been there, you know why.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
but
can totally relate.
but kind of went with it all. And I think the thing about SARS that really struck me was one is the level of staff anxiety that you have to try and manage, right? Because everyone processes this type of situation differently, and it's very true today as well. And I think it's really about kind of looking people in the eyes, and that's where the empathy point that I just posted on LinkedIn really comes in. It's understanding that you will feel differently about the virus or the crisis than other people will. And you have to really respect and hear people out. But ultimately, you do have to make decisions as well around running your business, not doing things. And I'll give you a small example. We were asked to basically buy vitamins, basically, for all of our staff in Hong Kong when SARS hit. And I said, well, everyone has vitamins, so we don't need to do that. And I don't want to start kind of getting into that level of care. But I do want to get into a level of care where I'm wearing a mask into the office, and basically I'm being seen as communicating. And I'm walking the floors in particular, right? Because it was, the walking the floors is important at that point in time, particularly when you spread over floors. So I just think it's basically about really kind of getting into the human psyche almost. And then for me personally, again, it was a tough time because my family here was more worried, of course, because they read the headlines and they don't really know what it's like on the ground.
Right.
But my family, basically, again, the schools were shut, so the kids were home, very similar to kind of what we have today.
Hmm.
And they were dealing with a new dynamic, no more tennis, no more swimming, no more ice hockey, all that good stuff, So it was very scary for them, and you couldn't leave Hong Kong. I mean, we had to basically stay. And I remember vividly a good friend of mine in Australia had passed away at that time. And again, I couldn't get to his funeral because I couldn't fly out of Hong Kong. So I think it was more stressful in that you don't have the family around to talk to you. Obviously, you can make a phone call to your parents. And I spoke to my mom just about every day when I lived overseas in particular. But, there's no amount of talking you can do to anyone back home that it really kind of measures the full impact of what's happening locally. So in many ways, it prepared me well for this. But this is, again, just on a much greater scale. And it's such a global issue. And it's such a global tragedy, right? It's hard not to feel basically the impact of what's happening today. When I think back to SARS passed pretty quickly. I would say at least it didn't feel that long. I could tell you right now, I'd say we're probably into this a month and a half. This already, and I'm sure everyone on the phone can appreciate this, this feels like 4 years already, right? So and I think for me, it's very different now. We've got about 3,000 people between New York and New Jersey, and then about 3,600 across the U.S. and capital markets. RBC itself has about 13,000 people across wealth management, City National Asset Management, and capital markets in the U.S. So it's basically managing staff anxieties that are very, very extreme and warranted, right?
Yeah.
I mean, again, so it's just basically kind of understanding that, and you cannot dismiss people's concerns. But again, you still have to make decisions from a management standpoint. You still have a business to carry on. And basically, you've just got to try and stay calm, but not be delusional at the same time.
Well, so let's talk about this now. And just as a reminder, folks, if you have questions, you can post them on the side of the screen. Several things, right? So we were talking about the Merrill culture, and you were talking about how there's a connection to the RBC culture. I think, as I talk to all the different companies, we've been having roundtables every week with a selection of companies just to sort of hear what's going on. I'm interested, how does this sort of, it's easy to have a leadership culture and an inclusion culture when markets are great. It's harder when markets are bad. It's really hard when we have a global meltdown like what we're having now. So it's, I think, a true test of a company's culture and leadership, to see what they're doing now. So tell me a little bit about that, and then I want to go into the empathy piece that you wrote about, because I think it's a really important topic for us to cover. So how is RBC continuing? You shared with me a couple charitable things earlier I'd love you to hit on, and just culturally, how is the RBC culture preparing and navigating through this?
Well, I think one is leadership truly does start at the top, and we have basically our CEO, Dave McKay, who's he's a top CEO. He'd get more attention if he were here in the U.S. In many ways, he's the Jamie Dimon of basically Canada, right? So
He's amazing.
he's been with the bank a long time. He's been CEO for nearly 5 years. He's a terrific leader. But, one of the things I really admire about Dave is he never tries to basically kind of make it all about him as CEO. He brings his leadership team around. He basically gives them all airtime. He's very thoughtful about the questions that he gets back. And again, it's a good thing to emulate. I mean, he's a great listener. And just because he has the CEO title does not mean he's going to be the one answering all the questions, right? So I really like that a lot. And then I think the culture, we have a collective ambition ethos, which is really about helping our clients thrive and communities prosper. And both are vitally important to us, right? And there's no doubt we, like other organizations, have come to the aid of our clients in a very stressful time throughout this. But what's been really impressive to me is the way we have actually stepped up our community involvement, where we basically, that second part, our communities prosper, it's very important to us. We have 7 employee resource groups. Part of it is our Pride Network, which you know well.
Yeah.
And I think, but, that's when you really test your culture and you test your commitment. And one of the first things we did early on was actually approach our nonprofit partners, because we have grants coming up to nonprofits all points of the year. But we knew just about every one of them was feeling stressed that they had never felt stressed before. We approached them, and I give this credit to our marketing team, our foundation team for doing this, is we approached them and said, we'll look at renewing your grant early if there's a need. And of course, 85% of people came back and said, yes, there's a need.
Amazing.
And personally, I take that to say, you know what? I normally back end my basically donations from a personal standpoint, but I front loaded them basically this year because now's the time. Hospitals need the money now. Your nonprofit partners need the money now. Your community support centers need the money now. And, this is a great time to actually kind of, what is it we can do to help, right? So, and I think then the other thing organizationally is just, it's just been like, again, we've said no layoffs this year. We're looking to hold our dividend policy intact, and I think we will do so. And I actually said at the beginning of all this to my team and anyone who would listen, this is when you really value working for a strong, cultured organization with a basically deep management team who's kind of seen a lot, but probably hasn't seen anything like this, right? So, for example, a small fun fact, the RBC Canadian Open has been canceled for the first time since World War II, right? That tells you our current management team has not seen anything like this.
Right.
But I think the communication, the empathy, putting the safety and health of our employees first, putting basically our commitment to the community right up there with the safety and health of our employees, it just kind of reinforced to me really why I joined you 5 years ago now. So it's just, it's a good organization. They're very committed to this part of the world. They're very responsible from an overall corporate citizenship standpoint. And it's just been a great trade. So
great trade. I love that. Well, I would underscore that. I mean, the support that RBC's given out next globally has been fantastic. And it's allowed us to do a lot of great stuff even now, which is wonderful. There have been 2 questions that have come in that I want to sort of combine a little bit. One around how do you think the demands on leaders have changed in the last 10, 15, 20 years, right? So, when you started at Merrill, for example, the leadership challenges you saw there versus what you're seeing now. And along the way, I think Luigi actually has a great question as well. One of the things that we're really focused on right now, of course, is mentoring and sponsorship and how you are navigating your career. A lot of folks that have mentoring and sponsoring relationships, FaceTime and getting to sit down with John Thurlow is an important thing in their career. And now working virtually, people aren't able to do that. So maybe kind of tackle both of those if you could. So how have you seen things change in terms of the demands as a leader? And then in that same vein, how can that translate into how people are navigating their careers right now?
So I think I'll take the demands on the leaders first, right? I think the world has changed massively. Since again, I went to Hong Kong, right? So that was 24 years ago, right? So basically that was a long time ago. And basically, I think just you think about how much the world has changed now. Like out leadership wouldn't have existed back then, with great respect, right? But the fact that, and obviously having 7 employee resource groups around various affinities, like I'm the co-executive sponsor of our Veterans Network, it wouldn't have basically shown up like that, nor would the commitments have been as strong probably, right? So,
Right.
but I think basically the demands on leaders, right? And I read a good article last night about like CEOs in particular, how now many of them are being viewed as CHEOs, which is Chief Human Experience Officer, right?
Oh, that's good.
It's really about connecting with people in a way that I think in the past we've had to connect with people to solve business, financial problems, etc., without frankly understanding much about what was going on in that person's life, or kind of again, where they fit in the world, it's their aspirations, etc., right? And I wouldn't necessarily say it was a colder world. I would just say it was a very different world. So I think, and you think about before this pandemic, what was the hottest agenda item for all CEOs, right? Is ESG, right? Environmental sustainability and governance, right? And I
Yep.
think, not long before basically this, we had the business leaders in the U.S. coming out and saying it's not all about profits anymore. It's about how we service our community, what we contribute, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of changes that have come about with demands on a leader just to lead their company and really focus on it from a financial standpoint and operational standpoint, are well beyond that. You really have to have almost a human fabric to the company. And that's, again, I truly believe RBC has that from a leadership standpoint. So, and then second the second part was about, I know it's from my friend Luigi, about mentors and sponsors.
Yeah, well, I want to just make a quick comment. I agree with you on what you're saying there. And I actually think that because of the focus on ESG and the human capital and the human connection of the fabric, to use your word, the companies have focused on the last 15 years, I think we are so much better prepared to handle a crisis like this and get out of it with an innovative approach and a positive outcome. I think if this crisis had happened 15 years ago, we would be in a very different situation from a corporate perspective. I don't think we would handle it nearly as well.
I totally agree.
So Luigi asked in terms of the FaceTime, in terms of mentoring, and a couple other folks since then have asked similar questions. So I'll kind of frame it with all three of them. One of the questions was around how, as a junior employee in a company, so take RBC or any of the companies that we work with, what advice would you give if they're nervous about uncertainty in the economy and the jobs? I mean, people are getting furloughed, potential layoffs. You said RBC is doing no layoffs, which is amazing, but obviously everybody's not in that position. And Luigi asked about FaceTime and sponsorship and mentorship. And one of the attendees actually asked how, as a junior employee, if the leaders in her or his company are not behaving well and navigating like you are, what advice would you give them? So maybe those three: the FaceTime, how would you sort of navigate uncertainty, and how would you navigate senior leadership not actually behaving well?
I think navigating senior leadership not behaving very well is a tough one. I mean, because frankly, you're not in a great position now to kind of opt out, right? But I will tell you, I opted out of Merrill partly because I knew there was a new leadership coming in with, being part of the deal team with Bank of America. I knew very well that kind of Merrill was gone and the new team's in. And I give actually Brian Moynihan a lot of credit. I think he's done a good job in kind of getting, Bank of America, and its acquisition of Merrill looks fantastic, right? So, but I think where you don't have basically leaders who are operating in a way you basically would like to see them, et cetera. It doesn't necessarily mean they're bad leaders. It just means they're basically kind of wired differently. And, again, maybe haven't followed that chief human experience officer type of role that much along their career. And there is basically, I mean, again, like our business in particular, and businesses of many of the people on the phone are very competitive. So, again, that manifests itself in different ways, right? And I think you just got to basically, what I would say, you can influence basically leadership style and basically the way they behave, right? I think, for example, like I really like Michelle Obama's statement, when they go low, we stay high. And I actually think you as a junior employee, a mid-level employee, a senior employee, as long as you keep that way, because people will handle the stress differently, then you'll do fine, right? Now, FaceTime, I think, honestly, FaceTime is up to all of us, right? I mean, you cannot be the infamous person who always wants to sit down with some leaders across the organization simply to say you sat down with John Thurlow or Todd Sears, right? You kind of got to go with a little bit of a purpose and basically what you're trying to accomplish, and never leave the conversation just to that person, right? So, and I'm very careful actually about people who come and say, would you help, would you be a mentor, right? Because I'm not sure, everyone's got to be invested in that. It's kind of like going back to diversity and inclusion. Like I always say, we have to make sure when people say they're supportive of diversity and inclusion that they model that behavior, right? Because it's actually, you want to say you are supportive of diversity and inclusion, right? But you have to model that too. just say it, right? So I think that's important, right? So I think FaceTime is something you can get, and I think most leaders are receptive to FaceTime. You just have to pick your spots, and then but you use that FaceTime to establish a rapport. So next time you walk by that person will say, "Hey, Todd, good catching up, and just how you doing?" and spend a few minutes with you. And sooner or later, that few minutes, you think of this, Todd, right? We both left Credit Suisse. You left in 2010. I left in 2015, basically, right? And here we are 10 years later, RBC is a sponsor about leadership. And I've told you before, I'm proud of you. I'm really proud of what you've done without leadership. And I'm proud that we still have the relationship that we do. And you think of where it started. I still remember when you left Credit Suisse. I was saying, I'm sorry to see you go, right? So, and it's basically, but look at what you've done since then, right? So I think FaceTime is always possible, but you got to pick your spots. And frankly, you can't spread yourself too thin.
Yeah.
Pick a few people who you really want to get FaceTime with. Try and get that FaceTime, but try and use it in a way where they know that you're invested in it as much as you want them to be invested in. And then the last point around mentors and sponsors, I always tell people this, right? To me, the most important thing is mentors, right? Because if you have good mentors, your sponsors will multiply by a factor of 10, right? If you have good mentors, you really basically kind of take the experience that they're offering you and basically you run with that and you basically stay in touch with those mentors, particularly as your career progresses. You will actually, you will have so many sponsors, right? I mean, it's, sponsors almost should come naturally. Mentors is a little bit less natural, right? But I've had some really, really good, like going back to the global financial crisis. I don't think he's on the call. But like Eric Heaton was the treasurer of Merrill. He was one of our top investment bankers, one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, and one of the most really, really genuine people who said, a lot of people call me JT. He said, JT, there's no pressure, but we are depending on you here. Right? So, and you need to educate me because he came into the treasurer's role probably about 6 to 9 months before things started to basically really unravel. So, but again, I've had so many good mentors along the way, and I love them all to this day. I mean, I really, I'm very grateful for any good mentors I've had in my career.
Well, I want to, and thank you for your kind words about me and out leadership. I want to thank you. Not thank you. I want to go back to something you said just a second ago, which is the connection piece with the mentors and keeping up with folks. I think for me personally, the ability to stay in touch with so many mentors and sponsors that I've had has contributed, right? So as you mentioned, we met a very long time ago, and we've been able to connect in various different ways throughout our careers. And I think that's an important thing. When I talk to our out nexters, I really do encourage them to make sure that you're not just looking for one mentor right now in this company. You're creating almost a virtual board of directors that stays with you for your whole career. And so that opportunity, I think, is important. And I think the other thing I want to just emphasize that you mentioned, which is it is a two-way street, right? So people come and want your advice and counsel, then it's up to them to actually take that advice and counsel, do something with it, share that back with you, and then pay it forward to somebody else, which I think is really important. And it sounds like, I know for a fact, actually, that's how you manage things.
And I would say one more point about mentors, though. A mentor does not have to be someone who you sit down with, right? So, for example, Dave McKay, our CEO, I consider him a mentor. Does that mean I sit down with him every week and shoot the breeze? No. I just basically watch kind of his leadership actions and I kind of get behind them, right? I mean, I can honestly say it's just easy to get behind, right? But I could say that for so much of our management team. Our CEO of Capital Markets, Derek Neldner, he's been in his seat since November 1. God bless him, right? So, but he's 22 years been the only organization where he's worked, right? And like immediately he's a mentor for the way he's handled everything, right? So again, a mentor doesn't necessarily have to be someone that you basically just come into contact with or you have a face-to-face meeting with. Yep,
I definitely agree. There's a question around career advice, and I want to kind of end with that, with your empathy piece. Before we do that, there was a question around managing burnout. And you mentioned earlier that, when you left Merrill, you took garden leave because you were kind of burned out. And, from the conversations I've had with so many of our leaders, I'll share one, anonymously. I had a conversation with a chief diversity officer who's not only concerned about layoffs happening and the impact on diversity that will have, but she's also navigating taking care of her 80-something-year-old mother who is now living with her. Her kids are home from college because, of course, they can't be in college, which, she thought that she was almost an empty nester, and she's navigating that. And by the way, she has a global role, and she is still sort of the breadwinner slash also cooking dinner for the family, right? All of those things she might have done in isolation or not all at one time, all kind of coming in on her. But I think so many people have experienced so many things in their personal lives that they would have been able to kind of keep separately from their work life, in quotes anyway, where it wouldn't have intruded as much or just added to the pressure. And I do think there are a lot of people that are starting to feel burned out. So what advice would you give folks in terms of, as part of this crisis, navigating just that burnout? What do you do, and what have you seen other leaders do?
So what I do basically, I think this is a period, like, again, unlike anything we've ever seen. And again, I've gotten a whole new appreciation of working from home. Again, I'm in my office now, but I have a 3-minute walk to work, so I'm blessed. I live in Jersey City, and I walk to my office, and there's nobody in the office, so social distancing is not an issue, right? But the way I think, what I'm actually getting an appreciation for is, we cannot expect, people are juggling a whole new dynamic now where kids are home, spouses are home, parents may be home or in a place where they can't get to them, which creates a whole nother level of stress.
Yep.
And they might not be available during the working day, but they're available to you it could just be odd points of the night, right? So I think you just kind of have to learn to manage to that and not get actually too worked up. If you can't get a hold of somebody at a time, you need to get a hold of them, right? And you just have to take a step back and understand that that person might be preoccupied with serving lunch, talking to the husband, talking to the wife, etc., right? All that stuff, right? So I think I've actually learned to kind of even modify my own style a little bit by understanding the pressures that people have now are severe. And I think you have to acknowledge that, and you have to actually be empathetic. Like yesterday, I reached out to a woman who's been working with us for 30 years, who lost her husband 2 months before the tragedy, basically the pandemic, right? And I said, how are you doing? I said, I'm sure it's even harder on you with your recent loss and feeling isolated. And, she was grateful I did, and I think it's important to kind of know those touch points. And those touch points often happen like either late at night or very early in the morning when you kind of find some time to do it. So I think it's important to basically have that, spot the warning signs, again, be empathetic, and really just kind of understand that this is a time. If anyone's not available for you at a point in time, it's not because they don't want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically, the way I manage my kind of stress is I'm pretty good about taking a good break each day to go for either a run or a long walk. You can't go to the gym anymore. But I do work 1 to 2 days a week. My sons live in Ridgewood, New Jersey. I basically hang out with them 1 to 2 days a week, working from there. And, they give me basically great pleasure, because, we just all get along well, and they're older now. So, frankly, they're pretty much on their own. So, and I'm not the pain in the neck I used to be as a father, right? So, so I just think it's basically really about, like, for me, it's about staying physically active, not being reckless, not basically kind of like I wear a mask when I go out now. And I basically, but you just gotta take care of yourself. And also you gotta avoid things like, it'd be easy to finish a bottle of wine every night now, right? But you really got to keep it to maybe a glass and a half.
Finish, start a bottle, drink,
Yeah, well, Friday's a little bit different.
There you go. Exactly.
Do things with your team. Like I'm doing with my team at 4:30 today, happy hour with basically trivia, right? So when you kind of got to do things like that as well, it's a good release. But what you really have to do is, like, again, when I go back to my apartment, I honestly do socially isolate in a big way. And you got to have that time to yourself. Like last night, I watched Seinfeld at 11, and it's just hysterical, even though I've seen the episode 40 times. But you got to give yourself, and getting sleep is important. It's critical.
Well, it's comforting to see Seinfeld, right? It takes you back to an earlier time, and it's a little bit easier. That's smart.
Well, the one thing I've really done too is I've actually cut down on watching the news 4 times a day, right? I watch the news now 6 and 6:30. That's it. I'm done, right? Because I was watching the morning news. It's a terrible way to start the day. And I'm watching the evening news, 11 o'clock. It's a terrible way to end the day. So Seinfeld has replaced the 11 o'clock news. And getting up in the morning, I'm basically either just I put on music, actually.
I think
music is a great influence in this point.
I do the same thing. I read the news 1 time a day because I feel like if there's something really important that happens, I'll get an alert about it. But otherwise, you're exactly right. I think it can be just overwhelming and not productive, really. It could just help you shut down. So the last two quick things. One, Jerry had a great question. Looking back, what is the most important career advice you'd give to your 25-year-old self? And I would add to that a question I was thinking, because I'm always interested. What is the best career advice you have gotten from anyone that you would want to share in terms of career advice for not just the crisis, but just in general? So what advice would you give your 25-year-old self, and what's the best career advice you've ever gotten?
Well, I kind of gave my 25-year-old self advice where, I mean, like we didn't get into it, but I actually, after high school, I kind of just went out and I traveled out west for a couple of years. And I actually worked in Yellowstone Park for almost 2 years, partly because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then after 2 years of basically bouncing around doing various odd jobs and making enough money to get myself back home on the bus, I just said it's time to get back to school. And I went to Pace at night, and Pace is a wonderful school. And going at night was really a big plus for me because, frankly, you're just a little bit more serious when you're going at night, right?
Yeah.
So like the Beekman pub downtown became a great watering hole for colleagues and you wouldn't hang out till 2 a.m, right? So my advice is really just kind of, again, for your 25-year-old self is, it is an important time in your life to think about what is it you think you want to do and how are you going to get there, right? So, and it doesn't mean you need to get there basically, now, right? So like, again, I got my undergrad at the age of 26. Right. And then I got my MBA at the age of 30. Right. So it's not like I followed a traditional path. So, and that would probably feed into my next piece of advice is, the traditional paths are not always the best paths. Right. So, for example, going to Hong Kong, I had so many people telling me, you're nuts. Right. But I just felt very deep down inside that doing an international basically assignment would benefit my family and would benefit me in so many ways. And years later, that's been proven correct. But you don't always get it right. I mean, there was some times in Hong Kong where I really questioned it. It wasn't easy to get back home after 8.5 years away as well, right? So
Right.
sometimes you just got to take risk that are calculated, though. You do have to understand the risk that you're taking. So, for example, somebody told me before I went to Hong Kong, John, you could get fired over there. And I said, Jim, I could get fired here too, right?
That's right.
So it wasn't like to me a big deal being fired in Hong Kong. They weren't going to I wasn't going to have to basically figure out how to get home. They would have took care of that. So, but I think it's really just about. I think it's like careers are a series of stepping stones. You never really get to the point you want to with one basically step, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think if you have the opportunity to work for a great company like I did at Merrill, like I now do in RBC, and you can take various assignments within your career within that one brand, it's actually a great way to go. I know it's at odds with probably a lot of the younger crowd today,
Mm-hmm.
but I actually would really strongly espouse that if you find a company that fits your mold, that fits you, that kind of gets you, and is going to support you, run with that. Don't even think about that. I can tell you I had 20 offers to leave Merrill in the time I had.
Right.
I said, no thanks, right? And I think that's my best. Don't be afraid to take risks, but understand the risks that you're taking.
I think that's a perfect way to end. I want to remind everyone, and we'll send the link to the piece that you published in LinkedIn about leading through uncertainty with empathy. Any final thoughts on that piece before we wrap up?
Well, again, it's just kind of one of those things that came to me kind of one of these nights when I was socially isolating in my apartment in Jersey City, and I just said, and we had just had a leadership call that Dave led that day. And I kind of reflected back on what he wrote and how true he and the management team have been to those words about empathy and transparency, right? And it's really kind of instilled in all of us, right? So where we've had, for example, positive cases of COVID-19 in our workforce, we've communicated that to people, right? And worked through long nights to do that, right? So, but I think it's important actually. And again, early on in this pandemic, you could think about kind of being the tough person, right? And like, this will be fine, but it's not. And you really, no two people have a similar situation. So you really got to manage, in my case, to 3,600 different levels of perspectives and anxieties possibly. So I would just say, model yourself after your leadership team, providing you feel that's a leadership team. And again, with Dave's piece, it was a nice short piece, which would be very hard for me to write. But it was a nice short piece, and it really had a couple of quotes in there that resonated with me, and a couple of buzzwords in empathy and transparency.
Well, I think it's a great way to end, and I want to thank you for being here. I think the transparency that you've shown, the empathy that you're leading by, and the stories that you shared, I think actually exemplify that. And I, from a personal perspective, know that to be true. And I want to thank you for being a friend and a colleague and a mentor to me as well through my career. I'm really excited to see where all of this goes. I am, as everyone knows, the eternal optimist. I do think we will come out of this in a better place than we started. And I do think it's because of leaders like you and companies like RBC. So thank you, John. I really appreciate you joining us.
Maybe I'll just give a couple of closing comments. I know we will come out of this, and I know we'll come out of it stronger. And again, I don't mean that. I mean, personally, we will, professionally, we will, et cetera. And there'll be a lot of things we take away from it that we should carry forward and apply to future learnings, right? But I do want to reiterate two important points. One is we're very proud to be a sponsor of Out Leadership. And personally, I'm very proud of you again. I mean, I've told you that before, and this is not just because we're doing this. I think, you took a risk at a time not many people would have. And I remember we discussed that when you left Credit Suisse.
Yeah.
And in my terms, you've crushed it. And so long may Out Leadership run. And again, we couldn't have a better organization to be associated with for basically from our Pride Network standpoint.
Thank you. John, thank you for joining us. Everybody have a great weekend. Stay safe. Stay 6 feet apart. Stay sane. Thank you. We'll see you next.
Thanks everybody who called in as well. So I appreciate it. Okay. Take care, Todd.
Take care, John. Thank you.
Thanks.